we are going to have a conversation about faith and progress. We are going to find overlaps and disagreements. We are going to get into the nitty-gritty. And our sponsors today are Wayfair magazine, of which Zach here is the editor-in-chief. It is a magazine of faith and letters from a Mormon perspective. Plow, of which I am a senior editor, is a magazine of faith and letters from an Anabaptist perspective, but it sort of tends to be more merely Christian, ecumenical. Interintellect is on a mission to create the most interesting conversations online and offline in a spirit of openness, friendship, and unity. They've been doing this for 6 years or so now, and I just feel like Anna has kind of launched herself into my awareness, at least, like a rocket, and I'm so excited for what these guys are doing. They don't do a lot of religiously themed events, but that is beginning to change. It also is a Discord to which you are invited, but I don't belong to it, and I only just found out about it right now, so I'm going to be joining. You should all join. Anna will tell us how to do that later on. Let's see. The way this started was that Zach was having a very special birthday. And he called up a bunch of his friends and said, for my birthday, I want to have a symposium. And we said, okay. So now let me introduce our speakers. Zach Davis is executive director of Faith Matters and editor of Wayfair. He is also the founder of Lyceum, an educational audio studio, and the host of Ministry of Ideas Writ Large, Illuminations, and Making Meaning. Joey Keegin is editor at The Point. He is a graduate student in philosophy at Tulane. He writes for Plow, The Point, and many other places. Tara Isabella Burton is the author of novels and nonfiction books, most recently Here in Avalon and Self-Made, and writes many places, including Plow, and with her husband writes a Substack called Line of Beauty. Murtaza Hussain is a writer on culture and politics. His Substack is his name, mazmhussain.substack.com. And I am Susannah Black Roberts, senior editor at Plow and at Mere Orthodoxy, also writing many places. And my Substack with my husband is at argosy.substack.com. We also all probably podcast, which is unfortunate. We are also, I'm really sorry to tell you, all on Twitter. And on April 13th, you can catch many of us again, also in New York, at another Intellect event, here in this room, on a much larger event, actually, that goes from like 2:30 in the afternoon until whenever, on the future of publishing. Joey, Tara, Maz, and Zach, 5 minutes or less each. This is a conversation about faith and progress. So to begin with, if during your initial words you can let the audience know, among other things, what your religious commitments are, that would be a cool place to start. My thought is that the idea of progress is linked in most religious traditions with what is called eschatology. And I'm kind of interested, one thing to talk about at some point during this evening is like how all of you think about your own hopes for the progress of whatever, society, America, whatever, how that links up with sort of metaphysical expectations. But also, whatever else you want to talk about, Joey, why don't you go first?
So somebody said, please, Zach, I think Zach
is going last. Zach is telling. Zach had said he wanted to go last.
I'm going last. You go first.
Tara goes.
Take us away. Take us away.
All right. Hi, I'm Tara. I am religious convinced. I am Christian. I'm Episcopalian. I'm slightly Anglo-Catholic. I don't know how specific we want to get here.
However specific you want to be.
And I guess I am curious. So I think there's two ways of approaching the question of progress. And one is, as you say, eschatologically. That is human history, the history of our society, whatever our means in the sentence, sort of tending towards a particular end or a particular potentially good, potentially bad outcome? Or what should the relationship of our understanding of societal progress, used sort of colloquially, be to the question of eschatological ends? What happens at the end of it all? And I think, increasingly suspicious, but both of the language of progress and that there can be a kind of meaningful link to the eschatological that we can know, which is to say, I think the questions of pursuing justice, pursuing goodness, pursuing a good society are perhaps best done when they are historically informed, but not part of a particular narrative of progress, if that makes sense. So to say, I think it becomes very easy when we talk using the language of progress, both to dismiss the past in a particular way, or say, things on X axis are better now than they were, and they will continue to be better, and we have learned things, and we are enlightened beings, and I think a lot of this, my suspicion of this comes from like Enlightenment language of humans becoming adults in a certain way. We were once moral children, and now we've learned, and we know better. And I think my suspicion of that is not because I think we are trying to kind of recover some superior pre-Enlightenment past, say, or that I'm not saying this from a necessarily reactionary perspective at all, but rather that I think that one of the relationship of a faithful person to contemporary culture must always be one of sort of loving criticism, but where we are engaging with the world that we are in, not with some sort of fantasy of a historical narrative that sort of we're identifying ourselves as part of. And I think the best way to do that, and maybe this is, see, as an Episcopalian, I feel like I'm just instinctively always going to take the moderate position, that a sense of humility vis-a-vis the history more broadly. What can we learn from the past? What can we critique about it? But also, what can we learn about the present? How do we sort of engage with the world that we're in meaningfully? And I think that I'm wary that the language of progress is a good one. And I think the sort of secondary question, which is that of eschatology, is also sort of fundamentally unanswerable. We don't know how history is going to turn out. We don't know exactly what the end of days looks like from whether within or without our religious commitments. And so I think a kind of more small scale approach to the question of how do we make this society better, this world that we are in better, for whatever definition of world, our neighborhood, our street, our city, our country, our world, that these are all kind of particular political communities that we ought to be engaging with and in. But I think that the only way to do so effectively is to resist sort of grand historical narratives that moralize history as going in a particular direction. So, progress. Not sure, what is it anyway? I'll end it there.
Joey, now it's okay. Maz, now it's your turn.
Sure. First of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Zach, for having me. I think I'm not as accomplished as some people on the panel. I think I was looking at their backgrounds. I'm not a philosopher or even a religious scholar. I'm kind of a layperson, but me and Zach have talked about some of these things before, so I thought maybe it'd be good to take part and share some thoughts about this. I'm Muslim. Actually, I'm fasting for Ramadan, so I haven't eaten anything since 4 a.m. last night. If I seem less lucid or say anything wrong, I'm going to blame it on that. And I'm actually going to probably break my fast on here. I'm going to have a date I'm going to eat at some point and when the sun goes down, so it's like a very immersive religious experience. And I was also very impressed that you guys have Substacks, your wives. My wife is there, so spouses, my wife is there. I'm going to talk to her about having Substacks. That's a great idea. It's very interesting. Like said, I'm Muslim. My understanding of these subjects when I was growing up, I didn't read in any languages I had access to. And I grew up here. A lot of very convincing and compelling answers how to reconcile religion and modernity, so to speak. So a lot of my influences came from Christian writers, actually, when I was younger, and particularly, like, not that I endorsed everything on every view or aware of all their views, but like David Bentley Hart or Edward Fesser, Ross Douthat, and Joseph Keegin. These people were really influential on me, especially the Catholic and Orthodox ones, because I was Muslim, so I was kind of a minority, and they're kind of like minority traditions within American Christianity, which is very Protestant, and Mormonism is also one of them too. So that was a really big influence on me in reconciling, and at some point I wasn't even sure if I was going to be, I remember when I was 19, I was thinking, am I even going to be religious, or am I just going to be, secular like most people I know? And then I read all these books, and when I was a big journey, I was like, okay, now I feel very much more solid about this. I'm not done, but I have to, now I'm more grounded as a result of that. So I'm still kind of learning about these things in a way. Like, I don't think that learning ever stops, but I've kind of come to the sense that, okay, let's take the Islamic tradition. I think that progress, the idea of it grew very organically out of Christian teleology, and liberalism very much so as well too. So these things, to Muslim people, they came as kind of like a foreign imposition or something they came to from the outside. So there's a very famous incident in history when Napoleon arrived in Egypt and he, invaded Egypt the first time in the late 18th century. And, Muslim countries have been conquered before by the Mongols, the Russians, and so forth, but they didn't really bother them that much because they felt that they had a superior culture they could assimilate people to. But it was the first time in history they felt that actually something was different here because they suspected that the French culture, after the Revolution, the Enlightenment, and so forth, maybe it was superior, maybe it was a better culture. And this engendered this identity crisis around ideas of progress or identity, which are still going on to this day and never really ended. My own view, and I kind of agree with Tara about some things she said as well too, is that, and I'm not to say that I'm totally sure about this, but I feel that progress is sort of very much tied to technological change, and it's almost like not a myth, but sort of like a magic trick that we feel that as long as the material environment is changing and our mastery over it is changing all the time, then therefore we're also making moral progress all the time too, which I think is not necessarily always the case. So, it's very hard to know what to say or what to do in this situation because I really enjoy a lot of the fruits of progress, so to speak, moral progress or what we think about it. But I do think that, I thought about this during the pandemic. I was like, if the lights went out for 2 months, like, would we regress back 1,000 years? And if it went out for like a year, would we regress back, 10,000 years morally? Hopefully it's not the case, but I do kind of think about that a lot. So when I read people like Ross Douthat and I see these very tactfully expresses these sort of doubts and concerns about the grander narrative society and progress and liberalism, I kind of agree with him. I kind of think that is kind of true. And, usually when I conclude when my remarks, I have a poem. And there's a poem I was thinking about when I was thinking about this event. It's by a very famous poet from the Indian subcontinent. His name was Muhammad Iqbal. And he wrote in Persian and Urdu. And he's very famous even today in Pakistan and Iran and Turkey, and places where the Persian language is very appreciated. He had a line in this poem called Shikwa. Shikwa means complaint. And the poem's addressed to God. And there's two components to it. One, he's talking to God, complaining. And the other part of the poem, God is complaining, responding to his complaint. And the crux of his complaint is that the world's totally changed and, everything is falling apart. And Muslims, you're speaking before, they become very backwards and, they don't have they're not leading the charge of humanity by any means anymore. And there's a line in the poem, he says, I'll say it in Persian, then I'll translate it. He says, Bani aghyar ke ab chane wale dunya, rege apne liye ek khayali dunya. What it means is the people who don't believe in God now seem to control the world and they have all the benefits of it. And we who always believe in you and always were faithful, all that's left for us is the imaginary world. And we can dream about it in our heads or think about it when we die, but that's kind of what's left for us. So, when I think about it, I kind of think that progress is kind of a train which is, we're on and we're going on it, and eventually the train will run out of gas, and then, I don't know, then we'll get off and then we'll see where we are. And that's kind of what I think about it.
Great. I'm glad I'm not the only pessimist. I sort of come in anticipating being sort of the lone skeptical voice, but I'm not. So I'm an Episcopalian, thing I came to later in life. I'm also a student of philosophy, and as a student of Socrates and a follower of Jesus, they both counsel pessimism. So at least with regard to political things, they're not especially sanguine about the prospects of pursuing all the things we would like to have in the world and actually making those things the case. So I tend to, I share a lot of these same critiques of progress. And I think that in regards to, how either of these traditions, a philosophic tradition or a religious tradition, would approach the question, or at least a philosophic tradition that's not, fully on board the Enlightenment train, right? Because of course this notion of progress is born out of philosophy, born out of a sort of enthusiastic modernism, kind of post-Cartesian desire to become the masters and possessors of nature, etc. A sort of earlier, more skeptical, more Socratic philosophical tradition would regard progress as a question primarily, and one that probably does not have all that positive of an answer. So as not to cover a lot of the same ground, though, I'll say I've been teaching a fair amount of early modern philosophy lately. So I'm a graduate student, and I teach this introductory philosophy class, and I've had my students reading Bacon and Descartes, so these early thinkers of the guys who sort of made modernity happen, who sort of invented, laid the groundwork for modern science and for this big project of controlling nature for the sake of the relief of man's estate, etc. And there's a moment in Bacon's New Organon where he makes his ambitions very clear. It's section 129, if you care to look it up. And he has this really remarkable statement, and I think about this all the time when I think about this question of progress, especially with regard to technology. He says, all right, so all the great statesmen, we think that they're really wonderful. We think they've done really great things for people, but it turns out that their greatness is limited because they've only been able to benefit those people who live in their political communities, right? The states that they control have a boundary, and outside that boundary, they can't benefit those people. I, Francis Bacon, I'm interested in benefiting everybody on the planet, right? Every single human being alive. How do you do that? Through discoveries and inventions. Well, what kinds of discoveries and inventions? Well, think about things like the printing press and the magnet and gunpowder, right? These are universally beneficent, good things that have done all kinds of great stuff for everybody. And somebody might say that they have some negative consequences, but don't worry too much about those. They're really, really good. And when I read that with my students, I say, okay, so we now live 3 centuries after this comment of Bacon's, right? Is it the case that gunpowder, the printing press, and the magnet's an interesting one. He says it's for use in navigation, which, if you think about it, in that particular use also has some ambiguities in it. Is he right that these are unambiguously beneficent inventions? Clearly the answer to this is no. And so I always wonder, it seems like this sort of early modern enthusiasm for technology, and this idea that technology is going to be the sort of vehicle by which we achieve an ever better and ever more comfortable sort of human life together. Bacon was a really smart guy. I don't think he was stupid, but I do think he was making a kind of bluff, right? Trust in the power of technology, trust in the power of inventions and discoveries, and we're going to reap immeasurable benefits from the storehouse of nature. Okay, so to a certain extent, that seems to have been true, right? Modern technology is really extraordinary. I think all of us have probably benefited immensely from it. So to a certain extent, we have to admit that there is some progress we can point to and say, wow, I'm sure and glad that they can put limbs back on and stuff of that nature, right? There was a time when you couldn't do such a thing. But with regard to progress in a more general sense, it seems to me like the question is still hanging open, and the notion of sort of moral progress of the Enlightenment, I'm not so sure about. Political progress, I don't really know. That also seems like something that both the philosophic and most religious traditions would have a kind of skeptical attitude towards. So, all that to say, I guess I feel ambivalent about the question generally, and we should talk more about technology in particular, because my thoughts on technology from the perspective of faith are very sketchy. I don't have an awful lot of them, but it does seem to me that there's something to be said on the question of progress. Maybe I'm being a gentle progress defender now against the skepticism, because I had to sort of stake out a different position. There's something to be said about if your faith counsels mercy. Well, maybe the development of medical technology is one possible way of achieving this kind of thing, of mercy and charity. But again, it doesn't seem so clear. So I just throw that out as a possible question.
I would just like to say that Matt Sitman, who's a friend of many of us here, when I tweeted the subject of this, he said, "Is anyone on that panel going to say anything good about progress?" So really, Zach, it's kind of up to you at this point.
I said something good
you
about
said
progress.
something good about progress. Okay.
Maybe one
Despite myself.
cheer.
Yeah.
First off, thank you all for being here. This really is just a joy, and I'm honored by your presence, and thank you, fellow panelists, and Anna for making this happen. Nobody seems that happy. Nobody appears to be invigorated with purpose, vision, creativity, or abundant life. Instead of moving forward in confidence, our culture, our civilization seems stagnant, exhausted, and full of doubt. What is wrong? Many things are wrong. Declining birth rates, historical guilt, an economy premised on scarcity and precarity, dehumanizing technologies, hyper-individualism, the death of God, and there are many others. But I want to focus my initial reflections tonight on how the way we think about the shape of history can affect, for good or ill, our sense of individual and social flourishing in time. The shape of history. Many early civilizations, like the Egyptians, Babylonians, or Greeks, believed that history happened in cycles, like the rising and setting of the sun, or the regular passing of the seasons. Nations would naturally undergo periods of birth, flowering, decay, death, and then rebirth. There wasn't much one could do to alter these cycles. They followed a cosmic order, a natural rhythm. And there wasn't really a purpose to history. At best, it was a playground for capricious gods. A different view of history began to develop in Jewish and Christian thought. For the writers of the Bible, history was not a series of unconnected events, but the vehicle by which a loving God realized his purposes for humanity. The creation, the resurrection of Jesus, and the last judgment gave history not only a beginning and an end, but a direction. Time was no longer a meaningless loop. It had become an arrow speeding towards a divine destiny. Deep purpose was found in understanding the arc of that arrow and aligning oneself with its movement. That began to change during the Enlightenment, Tara. Instead of God directing history, thinkers like Voltaire and Kant began giving a starring role to human reason. The purpose of history became less about preparing humanity for a paradise in heaven and more about achieving progress here on earth. Still an arrow moving forward, but flung forward by purely human hands. Enlightenment visions of progress have focused on values such as freedom, equality, reason, and mastery over nature. All wonderful gifts. But as the Romantics recognized, such gifts aren't enough to fill the human heart. I think the ennui and malaise that so many people feel today is because ordering a society around an entirely Enlightenment vision of progress is inadequate for creating conditions of deeper joy and flourishing. The Enlightenment vision also overly equates progress with newness. Ross Douthat's book, The Decadent Society, is a brilliant synthesis and diagnosis of decadence, convincingly pointing out that our fashion, movies, technologies, and political debates really haven't changed that much since the 1970s. He really, really wants a good new movie that is not a sequel. But I found myself wondering, why is Ross Douthat, a committed Christian, so hungry for newness? Why is novelty or change itself assumed to be a sign that a given culture is on the right track? Aren't Christians seeking not newness, but to faithfully live an ancient revelation? That witness will, of course, look a little different depending on the time and culture a Christian is living, but expressing newness for its own sake isn't, in my view, really the main purpose of a Christian life. Rather, it is to continually breathe fresh, immanent life into eternal, transcendent forms. To create a harmony between material embodied reality and immaterial ideals. In other words, the best view of history is neither a circle nor an arrow, but a combination of the two, a spiral. Let me give an example from my own faith tradition of how this might look in practice. Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, was born in 1805 in upstate New York and grew up amid the spiritual ferment of the Second Great Awakening. He prayed to know what was true and was visited in a small forest clearing by two beings, God the Father and Jesus Christ, who called him to restore the lost truths of the early church. Many other Christian movements at the time felt a similar desire to recover or restore so-called primitive Christianity, to remove all the accumulations and get back to the simple purity of New Testament Christianity. But Joseph Smith's understanding of restoration turned out to be quite different and more radical, and I think fascinating and instructive even for non-LDS people. Joseph Smith did begin with some restoring work you might expect. He brought back primitive church offices like apostles, teachers, and deacons. He sought and manifested gifts of the Spirit, like speaking of tongues, angelic ministrations, etc. But then it gets really weird. He restored the idea of God speaking again now, in our time, both by bringing forth the Book of Mormon, a set of scriptures, and also by receiving new revelations directly from God. There are hundreds of "Thus saith the Lord" revelations and proclamations that Joseph received. But it gets even weirder still. He brings back temple worship, something that Jews themselves had abandoned in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. He created new priesthood powers, one named after the mysterious biblical figure Melchizedek. And most infamously, Joseph brings back patriarchal polygamy, until the United States military snuffed it out of Utah, mostly. All of Joseph's theological work, in my view, was spiral-like. It was a creative, dynamic recycling of inherited forms to create genuinely new, vital combinations. It linked old and new together in a sacred harmony. Now, even though Brigham Young's sexual lifestyle is now celebrated in New York Magazine, I'm not suggesting you all become Mormons, but rather that there is probably a reason why most observers point to Utah as being the least decadent place in the Western Hemisphere. It is a spiral culture, a people grounded by the circle and invigorated by the arrow.
So with that, I'm going to open up you guys to a conversation amongst yourselves, and then we're going to go to you guys. So I guess one thing to ask would be, Joey, do you want to respond to Zach's vision of, like, what would your pushback be if you had a pushback?
Remember, it's my birthday, Jay.
It's your birthday. The attention to this like idea of the shape of history, I think, is a really good place to go. That much of the time history is invoked as if it were like an obvious thing, right? That it's obviously a linear progress of the actions of human beings, individual and collective, that's heading somewhere. Maybe we either know or we don't know, but nonetheless, this is the shape of it. But I think you're exactly right that there are different shapes that the idea of history might take in our minds. I mean, one of the great diagnoses of this is Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History for Life. If you haven't read it, highly recommended. He questions the very notions of the ways that we think about history. I think it's a very useful sort of way of approaching the question. I think that this spiral, that sort of model that you propose is really interesting, of constantly reinvigorating the present with reference to the past. That seems like a good way of doing about things, but I guess the question would be, in a place like the United States, right, we have an enormous amount of possible pasts to draw from, right? A whole bunch of different people from a whole bunch of different kinds of places with a whole bunch of different senses of what the ancestral is that you might tap into for the sake of the present. And maybe this idea is one that can only, right? And we're talking to a certain extent about, well, what are the relationships between concrete, small-scale communities and then what's happening at the level of the whole? Maybe this kind of idea of rethinking of the shape of history, of trying to sort of develop a more dynamic relationship between the past and the present can only happen on the small scale with a handful of people who more or less share a worldview. That even is still probably pretty difficult in a place like America. We're a very contentious society. There's a lot of disagreement over what that old thing is and how exactly to understand it and how exactly to make it new, as Ezra Pound says, to take that old thing and use it for life today. So I don't know. It sounds good, but I see difficulties, and I wonder, maybe we can talk a little bit about how what some of those difficulties are, or how we might overcome them.
Maz, I'm wondering, so to what degree, this is just my curiosity, so Islam is an Abrahamic religion, but you'd referred to the sort of idea of an arrow of history as being more of a Jewish than a Christian idea.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a sense of that, I mean, Islam is not a pagan sort of cyclical religion. So isn't there still that vision of an arrow of history in Islam?
There is, yeah. There's not the idea of cyclical history, which you might find more in pagan religions, or even Hinduism would have it as well too. I think that it's interesting because obviously this idea of progress, I said it emerged organically out of Christianity, but I think that a lot of the developments I'm referring to were actually post-Enlightenment in the sense of the perfectibility of the world and novelty and change of the world and so forth. I think that, I don't want to be like a curmudgeon or ungrateful in the sense that I'm sitting in this nice air-conditioned room, I took the train here, and I'm like lambasting material progress, and like, I don't want to say that. It's just that I do think that the important thing of that any form of progress should be embedded with some sort of baseline. Like, let's say you want to make sure that it's always, you have like God or Jesus Christ as like the lodestar that you're embedding any form of progress around, because when it becomes unmoored from that, human beings just seem to sort of embrace worship of the self, and then all the material progress becomes further mustered towards that end. And personally, I don't think that I'm worthy of being worshipped. Knowing myself very well, I wouldn't want to do that, and I think that everyone is kind of like that to some degree. So, in the Islamic tradition, I think that I would say, and I'm not like, I can't say a definitive answer about this, but I think that their understandings, they're doing like catch up in a way, because of the fact the Enlightenment happened in Europe first, all the grappling with it. I will say that in Muslim countries, they consume Western modernity on 50-year time delay, basically. So even down to material styles, like the way the cities are developed and the way philosophical debates happening, I think that that's the case now. So I tend to look, not because I think the ideas are only inherent to Christianity or Judaism, but I just tend to look there first, I have in the past, because I find the cutting edge ideas for grappling with these questions are from those thinkers. I think it's changing now a little bit, actually. I think there are some catching up, especially in Western countries. But yeah, I think that because Islam is sort of like, it's in the trifecta of religions, and it came to the last one that came, the third one, and especially now, given the socio-political situation, I tend to think, it's not that it doesn't have those ideas in it, it's just that I'm not looking there first all the time, or having been in the past at least, for answering these questions.
Yeah. Tara, do you want to?
Yes, I want to push back gently on Zach on something, because I am actually, in pushing back on you, want to push back on myself, which is to say, I think that I am, like many of us here, maybe all of us, sort of instinctively wary of the idea of progress, moral, historical, technological, as being an unallied good. I do see, among other things, a sort of strand of decline, or what I would consider moral decline, that does worry me, in terms of what I see as the shift, this profound shift, post-Enlightenment, sure, let's say, to kind of contextualize it, between a vision of the good as something that is ordered to something outside us, to God, or to kind of a sense of the transcendent, to, roughly speaking, a degree of self-worship, the idea that our desires, our kind of what we want internally, is the closest conduit we have to the good. I wrote a whole book about this. That said, one of the things I want to avoid in this conversation is the idea that there is a kind of unique moral evil in the present day. And you were kind of reading us an extremely, I think, accurate and bleak vision of where we are historically. But I don't know that there has ever been a historical era where things were good. I wonder if it's like the opening of Anna Karenina. All historical eras are unhappy in their own way. And I'm not sure, even as I spend a lot of time like decrying the modern world, I'm very glad to have penicillin. And I'm very glad that I'm not living in a time where people are murdering each other over religion. Sorry, let me rephrase that. I was thinking, I'm glad that I'm not living during the 16th century wars of religion, and that sort of in the Western world is not, it's not happening right now in New York City, and I'm glad of that. There we go. But what I want to say there is that how can we talk meaningfully about, and I think one of the things as a Christian, I have a theological anthropology of the human condition, what it means to be human, what it means to be fallen, that is not historically grounded. It is, we, as human beings, we are sort of so enthralled to sin that we will mess up the good things. We get technology, we use it we get the printing press, we use it to disseminate hatred. We get gunpowder. I mean, I'm not sure there's a good version of gunpowder, but
fireworks.
We fuck fireworks, yeah, and we fuck that up too. And so I'm curious about a way of thinking. Is there a way that we can think meaningfully about the ills of our contemporary era without kind of fetishizing the grand narrative of decline? And I think that particularly from a Christian perspective, that's all the more important precisely because I think there is a narrative that is true in Christianity, and that is God became man and God came back, and that narrative grounds us in a way that kind of I think is a constant reminder to reject aesthetic narratives, either of progress or of decline and return. And I think both of those are kind of instinctively sort of lend themselves, or we have those narratives when we want to tell a sexy story about history and our sexy, unique, special place in it, either because we are the winners, we are at the smartest, best time that has ever been, or we are, singularly cursed to be living in the most sort of godless of times. And I don't think either of those is true. At the same time, I think that it's sort of the eschatology of Christianity, I think, is the most important thing kind of already happened. Like we have, Jesus dies, Jesus comes back. In the certain sense, it's over, and the sort of aesthetic meaningfulness of history can only be accessed from a degree of kind of sacrificing our own interestingness. Which is to say, I am a sort of progress skeptic up to a point, although again, if offered, I probably would stay where I am in 2024. But is there a way of analyzing the ills of the time without resorting to a narrative either of decline or of progress? We haven't fixed it enough, or things were good until those pesky Enlightenment philosophes ruined everything. And is there a useful way of engaging with historical and cultural and ideological change that sort of allows us to sort of hold fast to what is good? Even as we kind of engage in critique and even condemnation of what we see as societal ills. And is there a way of doing so that is humble enough to leave open the possibility that we are completely wrong, and that there will be generations who see far better than we do, or we may be found wanting by future generations, correctly or incorrectly, because we have no control over that. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder about how do we sort of how do we make the world better as best we can without falling into the sort of aesthetic grand narratives either of progress or regress?
Yeah. I totally agree with Tara. And I actually, that was a kind of an interesting way to put it. I kind of, the idea that like the most important thing has already happened, which is that Jesus died and then did not stay dead. I think that's true, but that it also is like, so how do you then bring that into the present, and what are we hoping for in the future? And that is a kind of like, one answer is the Mormon answer, which is like this idea of continuing revelation. The other would be a sort of like Protestant or Catholic answer, which would be something more like, we're hoping for a second coming, and meanwhile, that bringing that spiraling is about sort of taking communion and returning to like the origin moment, the sacrificial moment through the Eucharist, and through our acts of service to each other, and like figuring out which is the right way to spiral is kind of important. But why don't we now open that up to questions from the audience, from Santi?
I have a question for Birthday Boy and for Murtaza, because there's part of me that envies you guys, because you're part of faith traditions that are actually growing in the secular West. But my question is, well, I'm a Catholic, so we used to run things in the West, and then the secular Enlightenment came, as Murtaza pointed out, and we tried two different strategies. In the late 19th century, we attacked progress, and people haven't thanked us enough for that. And then in Vatican II, we maybe embraced it too much, but don't tell Matt Sidman and Matt Goodway. But eventually, though, there is a sort of tension between the secular Enlightenment and the Catholic Church that has not been fully resolved, and the church is in such a bad state that it's almost a moot point. But eventually, the Mormons and the Muslims in the West, obviously Islam has many other countries where it's the dominant religion, and Mormonism is spreading in South America a lot. But in the secular West, you guys will grow and grow and grow, and eventually you'll hit that point where the tension will be a lot more felt. And what's an enlightened Western Islam 100 years from now look like? And what does an enlightened Western Mormonism look like 100 years from now?
I mean, my first answer is I do think we're in somewhat of a post-truth environment, or at least there's a lot less general trust of reason to access truth in a way that is extremely threatening to religion. So 10 years ago, all the people that I knew that were leaving Mormonism were like, I looked on the internet, Book of Mormon's not true. Now they leave for like much more emotional reasons, like I don't feel like I belong. The truth, that's almost like, well, who knows what's true? So it's possible that the fragmented epistemological authority that the internet creates makes some of the crisis different a little bit. However, you don't need to wait 100 years, Santi. Like, Mormonism is struggling right now to keep its young in a severe way because, internet just is acid on faith, acid on commitment.
No, I was thinking the opposite. I thought Mormonism is going to take over America.
No, that's Amish. Yeah.
No internet. No internet.
You can't have phones. You can't have
Is there going to be a
phones.
creative engagement, like when Greek philosophy re-entered the West, the Catholics didn't just capitulate. There was a synthesis.
I mean, there's Wayfair. We'll see.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that 100 years from now, whatever enlightened Western Islam looks like, it has to look very American or very British or very German or French or wherever. Because obviously Islam is a globalized religion, but when you go to Turkey, people don't think of it as an Arab religion, think of it as a Turkish religion. Or they go to India, think of it as Indian religion. Or Africa, think of it as African religion. They don't see it as foreign. So it has to take on, it's like, the analogy people use is you pour water into a vase and it takes the shape of the vase. And the water is still there, but then it has to be in a cultural form and a style that is palatable and makes sense in the history and traditions of that place. And it's because it's not ethnically specific, it should be able to do that. But I actually agree with Zachary in the sense that everyone seems to think their own tradition's in crisis, because everyone, Muslims it's a huge crisis, and everyone's like Muslim in the future. So they don't really have a great sense of confidence and the belief that the future is theirs. I don't really perceive that. They think that there's a lot of big problems, particularly because, you know, Muslim young people, they grow up here, they're susceptible to the same social pressures and the same, like I mentioned when I was younger, I had like these big doubts. Like every kid, I think, has those doubts, like regardless of their parents' beliefs, their backgrounds. So I think that, you know, I don't really, will Muslims be recognizably the same they are in the United States, whatever exists 100 years from now? I don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it's not, maybe it won't. But yeah, I don't know. I would think that if it were to, it would have to be through institutions which somehow make it fit into the prevailing norms of society that exist. I think the interesting thing, the complicated thing in the United States is because all the assimilatory pressures which usually exist in the United States, it's sort of dissipated a lot. It's become a lot weaker in the sense. So when people say it has to be a very American, was there consensus what that means anymore? Like no one really knows what that means. What's the aesthetic that represents anymore? I don't know. And I think a lot of young kids today see in recent events, in context of it, they see Islam as like a countercultural religion, or somehow it's like just a religion of like third worldism or something like that, or like some like mix of leftism with religions. This is like the religion of that. And that's really not the case, actually. It's not really, I don't view it, just looking at it just rationally and examining history, it's not accurate. But if that's what makes sense to people, maybe it'll take some sort of color like that. There's actually a quote by René Girard, the French philosopher. He said something after 9/11. He said that Islam is the voice of the voice of the frustrated masses in their mimetic rivalry with the West, and that's just to be Islam is the word we ascribe to that, actually. So he's not talking about the religion itself, which is something very conservative, differently, but something which is being adapted to political circumstances. So, you know, I think maybe it'll become like that. It'll become a voice of political protest, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I wouldn't like that, actually. I think that'd be a very great failing, because the purpose of it is actually to maintain a connection with God. And you maintain a connection with God, the good social benefits should flow naturally down from that. And it could be very conservatively American. It could be like Midwestern aesthetic, it's totally fine. It could be Southern, it's completely fine. But I think that as long as God is the center of it, that's the most important thing. If something else becomes the center of it, then I don't think that whatever comes out later will be good, because it starts from the wrong premise.
Ian.
So I'm just finishing this, reading this book called The Time to Keep Silence by Patrick Leigh Fermor, which is lovely. So it's basically this travel journalist who goes to a series of monasteries. He hates it at first every time. He's like, these people look like death. This place is full of death. And then within a couple of weeks, he's like, this is magical. This is, he's immersed in this deep contemplative joy. And so one of the stories he tells of each monastery is its long history of 1,000 years or whatever. And it's sort of like the scene in Monty Python where the king's like, well, I built one castle in the swamp and it sank into the swamp, and I built another one, that one sank too. And the stories of these monasteries are like that. They're cyclical. They're like, well, one king came and knocked it down, right? And then 45 years later, 3 monks came and they started tilling the soil, and then within 100 years there were 100 monks, and then that one was destroyed and they came back again. And they end up building in each case these like incredibly deep and beautiful traditions, this beautiful craft work, like this beautiful life. But it seems like that kind of work has a kind of timelessness to it, right? To dig in with 3 monks and just start having a monastery until it becomes beautiful 100 years later, it's hard for me to imagine in that cycle of building and destroying, monks thinking either about forward or back, right? Like it seems like there has to be a sort of total immersion in the present, in this building that you're doing in the present, that maybe is uniquely facilitated by a religious vision, I think probably. But I wonder, are we quite certain that thinking in terms of progress and regress or the sort of operative and useful terms?
That's a great question. And I'm going to answer because I can. And then Tara can. But I feel like it's a particular way of thinking about like the New Jerusalem or the world to come in Christianity that I think allows that to happen, which is that like you're not actually banking on succeeding. Certainly not in your own lifetime, possibly ever, depending on your eschatology, but like what you are banking on is like what you're building is not going to be lost. So if you build a beautiful, clerestory or whatever, or if you make a stained glass window, or if you illuminate a manuscript, or if you publish a gorgeous magazine, they all might like go into the landfill, but that thing will, in some actually fairly material and weird sense, not be lost. And so I think that that is what allows that kind of patient, we can sort of leave we are aiming at something permanent, like not just long term, not like 1,000 years, but like permanent. And so we don't have to like make sure that the 1,000 years happens because the millennium is going to happen. So God's going to take care of the 1,000 years. I don't know. That was just. But were you gonna?
I just wanted to add something that you actually inspired it or reminded me of, Susannah, when we were talking earlier, which is I think liturgical time is one of the sort of weird things about Christian theology, but also about the sort of relationship between history, linear history, cyclical history, and the fact that participation in liturgy is, especially like the more, I think, sort of liturgically robust tradition you're in, the better. The more I think that this is palpable, which is, and I think the sort of example of the monastic example is a really useful one here. You are simultaneously, you are in the present, but there are certain ways that we participate in not just in the past, in the moment of Christ's death, but also in a kind of a present that is not a sort of horizontal present. That is the sort of the presence of all believers, say, or the present, and I think that return, which is neither exactly cyclical, because I think I really like the spiral analogy, that simultaneously history is moving forward. There is an eschatological end. We are not just sort of returning always to death and a particular death, historical death, and particular historical resurrection, and yet we do not only exist in the present. And I think that is a sort of, it is a mystery of the Christian faith, of my Christian faith, certainly. It's absolutely a mystery to me. But I think that it does invite a perspective that is simultaneously present. We are, and so such that we can only participate, our only political work can be, it can be sort of ideal for the future, in the sense that we were trying to do a good thing to leave a better world for those behind us, and yet it has to be about sort of pursuing true things, good things, mediated through the like limited understanding we have in a particular place, in a particular time, knowing that sometimes that means like, this particular fire is what we have to put out right now, or this is a particular way in which justice needs to be enacted here and now. But ultimately, that the sort of the sense of engaging with the present as present rests upon a faith, really, that we have some kind of access to a vision of something that helps us to understand what the New Jerusalem might kind of look like, which is perhaps a bit of a hedgy way of saying it, but I think that kind of constant interplay between the complication of being embodied in a place and a time, and also that particular place and time being part of another presence that is always available to us to orient us, allows for that sort of twofold movement. And this is certainly like, I don't want to risk saying like, here are some cool metaphors in Christianity and that's why it's pragmatically true. No, like I really believe this literally is true. But I think that there is the sort of, the whole God became man thing does sort of require us always to be so conscious of, there's an eternal out there, and there is something kind of specific and material and present here. And like, whenever I find myself veering too much off in one or the other direction, it is precisely that duality that like moves me back to the center, because again, Episcopalian.
Professor Lilla. Yes.
Oh, hi. Following on Tara's remarks, I have the feeling here that it might be a good time to start making some distinctions that would help guide the conversation. And the first distinction that hasn't been made and was glossed over or denied, I can't tell, is that there's something called the Judeo-Christian theory of time. The Jewish tradition, the Christian traditions are completely different. And they are both messianic, and in Judaism, messianism comes in very late, right? But essentially, the Jewish picture of time is that there's a covenant between God and man, and time rolls along, and human beings depart from the covenant. God is disappointed. He either lets them suffer for a while because of their departure, or helps them up, or punishes them, and then order is restored. There is no sense that tomorrow has, the significance of tomorrow depends on the significance of today, or the reverse. So time doesn't matter in this vision until the Messiah comes, and he'll come when he comes. And to desire to hasten the arrival of the Messiah is a great sin. Christian time, on the other hand, is broken time for the reasons Tara was talking about. You know, Hegel called the incarnation the turning point of history. And so Christian time is broken before the ante-Christian period and the post-Christian period. And the theological problem has always been how to connect those two, or not, or make sense of that. Either the pagan period was just darkness and randomness, or it was a preparation for the gospel, as Eusebius wrote about, right? But once you break time, and in a way, what happens is, for the individual Christian life and for Christendom, is that life from that moment on has a mission, it has a telos, it has, so action, two things happen. One, you know where to orient yourself and orient your action because you're moving towards something. And you know where you are to understand your condition, right? So there's a far greater distinction between the Jewish and Christian conceptions of historical time than there is between the Christian and the Enlightenment one, where the differences are comparatively minor. It's just the absence of God. And so Christian, you know, so much of what you may want to blame modernity for in its theory of progress is owing to Christianity. If you compare theories of history and cultures worldwide over time. And so the first question to ask yourself for anyone who is a believer is, does time matter or not? Do I need to have a sense of the time in which I'm living, not just that these are dark times, light time, bright times, in order somehow to know where I am and to orient my action? And so Augustine was sort of split about this, right? And the church was ever since. So after the fall of Rome, he tells Christians in the city of God, time doesn't matter. God's taking care of that. What matters is our relationship, right? But on the side, he tells his disciple Orosius, while you're at it, please write a providential history, right? So we're covering both bases. So there's always been that tension in Christianity. And what gets lost, I think, in the modern period is the way Christians or people of faith understand themselves, is that it's harder for them to see that there's another option, which I think was, again, knocking around in what Tara said. And that is to say that eschatology has nothing to do with time. It has to do with a way of orienting yourself in relation to an event that's happened, mainly, but also an event that will happen. And so, you know, it seems like a time perhaps to go back and read Karl Barth, especially, who, you know, emphasizes, you know, his great battle against the German Christians was to say, do not invest yourself in time. The relationship between the created world and God is that they touch like a tangent to a circle, and it leaves a crater, and that's all to be said, right? So I think some of these distinctions, the orientation and action, whether time matters or not, in terms of eschatology, might help orient some of these discussions.
I think that's a good point, and I also think that one set of ideas that might help with that is that, like, what a huge thing that Bart was rejecting, at least as I understand it, was the postmillennial understanding of eschatology. So, like, Bart was saying, actually things are not, he was kind of anti-social gospel in a way, but he was also anti-social gospel of the right, which was kind of Nazism. And so he was, or the Nazi version of Christianity, so he was saying, like, you can't say that things are getting better either in a liberal or conservative way and that that's God's will, because he saw what happened when people did that in the conservative way, and people, it's maybe a little bit less scary when people do that in a liberal way, but if you took Marx to be doing that in a liberal kind of Christian heretical way, that would be equally scary.
Right, but Karl was a great activist.
Right.
Right? He
Well,
was
because
a great
you can't act. You can't act.
You can act and you must act.
But you don't think that
because you're witnessing. Yeah. And it's not part of any story.
You're not part of the engine of history. I feel like I'm also in the Anglican tradition, and so I also want to have it both ways. But anyway, I feel like we should move on to, yes, George.
I'd like to lower the level of the discussion by asking about how one measures progress. If you graph the life expectancy over the last 200 years, it's roughly this. If you grasp calorie intake over the last 200 years, it's roughly this. Likewise, our average hours of education per person, same. Average hours of education per female person, like that. Average lifetime earnings of females.
I'm sorry, what I said about the Enlightenment, George.
So, and conversely, things like deaths from smallpox, and deaths from cholera, deaths from tuberculosis, like that. So most of these examples I've gotten from Stephen Pinker, who has many. But there are also plenty of negative trends. Number of guns, that's one number of hours spent in the correctional system, is one of those. But I can't help wondering if the right way to discuss progress is to make careful measurements of trends. Empirically, you debate it and refine until you agree about them, basically, within the people having the conversation, and then balance them, one against the other. Some of them may actually be interdependent, in which case you decide whether to, what to do. In all cases, actually, the trends give you an indication of what to do. Should discussion of progress be a little more empirical?
Anna.
So I really deeply disagree that the best thing has already happened. I think we wouldn't be here if that was true. And my question is, according to all of you on the panel or the audience, would there be a religious case to be made for progress? That in humility celebrates the greatness of the human mind, service to mankind, betterment of the world. Because we're sitting in Manhattan, where I'm from, in a little village where people don't have proper health care, electricity, knowing that Jesus has come back once, not twice yet, it's not going to help them. It's their fellow men who help, who go there, who work, who build, who heal, who invent things. And I think that should also be at least given a good word.
I mean, there is.
To actually say this, you made a really good point about all these metrics you talked about, and I wouldn't myself want to go back to the world before those metrics changed, and I think most people here would feel the same. It's just that what Zach's comments and his initially pointed out is that despite achieving all these significant and very admirable changes, people seem to be not happy. There seems to be a lot of searching and questions. I think the problem is that, yeah, well, I think the issue is that, you know, we achieved all these great, incredible mastery over nature, which we've sought for basically the whole human race. And, well, actually, I should say, since we started thinking it was possible to do so. But I think that some aspects of tradition, which we liked before, which kept us grounded and happy, were tossed out with the bathwater somehow. So I think the goal is how do we have material progress with the good aspects of tradition. And when measuring progress, I think there's also another problem, and Ross Douthat writes about this. He said that historically, societies always had a frontier that they could orient themselves towards. So you could judge progress by how much of the frontier you brought into your own ambit, or, you know, civilized according to your own standards, or brought, you know, made your own in a way. But now the whole earth is actually been mapped. It's like pretty much a closed system now. So in the absence of a frontier, people maybe will draw inward instead, and their self will be the frontier. So you have to chart new frontiers of the self and self-actualization and so forth. And I think that's actually a recipe for making potentially unhappy, maybe. That's also part of it, and I think it's one of many causes. Space could be a frontier, but we cannot really, each individually is so involved or can be involved in that, and I think resources not devoted to that. But I think those aspects of it too, like there's things what you're saying is absolutely 100% true, and to deny that would be wrong. It's just that why, despite all those achievements, are we having this conversation? Why is it a salient conversation with so many people? And I think something is missing that we've lost while achieving these things.
Well, one thing I'll briefly offer, I think we're having this conversation in large part because the graphs kind of go like this, like all the way up and then a little notch down, right? Yeah. So especially with like life expectancy kinds of things, right? There has been this something is up that the chart stopped going up in the right way, and so we're all freaking out about it. And I think it actually provides a good opportunity to rethink things like, what do we mean by progress in the first place, right? Why do we have to think of time in terms of history at all, right? I mean, it's interesting how even just a little notch like that can raise some really profound questions.
Yeah, there's just to sort of get back to Anna. Sorry. I mean, there is a Christian tradition that would say absolutely yes, we can expect, you know, physical and moral progress from the world, which is postmillennialism. The idea is the millennium is now, and we are and Jesus came into the world and spread new ways of, you know, both his supernatural power and also new ways of thinking about people and their value and their dignity, and that keeps sort of trickling down, and we can expect things to get better. So there is. I just want to say there is a kind of there is an account.
Why can't it get better?
They can, no.
Who caps it?
Well, no. I mean, post-millennial Christians would say no one caps it. Like that's how things get better completely.
Sam, did you want to respond?
If I may, just in some context, I'm writing a book with Columbia about the Christian and philosophical origins of transhumanism. And I think to just throw a bomb into the conversation the way Bart did into his, I think we should accept as a radical premise that we don't have a choice about believing in progress. Progress is the framework of globalism, and globalism must be dealt with at the scale at which it operates. Localist options are an essential part, I think every wise person agrees, of a better society. But the people who control the world literally must deal with global systems, the flow of capital, the flow of nation-state jurisdictions, international disputes. Where do these laws come from? As Professor Lilla said, the Christian legal tradition. Think about Germany, influenced by Savigny, the Neo-Kantian legal tradition. It goes back to Kant, perpetual peace. All the great German idealist philosophical writing on history is essentially the most profound work in Christian eschatology. So the context for the rise of a belief in a universal good, like you were saying, Joey, and this is the radical vision of Christianity, that the Christian society should be responsible for the universal welfare of the species. Such a vision exists in no other religious tradition that was operationalized as part of a self-conscious imperial project. So it's a simple fact that the imperial global structure of the world is the manifestation of the Christian eschatological vision, debated endlessly. Read books 3 and 4 of Leviathan. In the Kingdom of Darkness, Hobbes does not want there to be temporal power because he's an anti-republican. Then read Milton. The Republicans are radical. Kings don't want one king. Kings don't want Jesus to come back. Republicans like Milton believed very fervently that one of the reasons republicanism was the right position, you guys probably know Eric Nelson's work on this, on the Hebrew Republic, is exactly because we have no right, if we say we believe in Jesus, to bow to any other king but he. And Hobbes hated that. So these eschatological debates about the future being now or deferred are always debates about the meaning of the Messiah. We exist in a perpetually messianic context. Look around, Dune, the most epic, wide-scale, successful movie, beautifully produced, the Avatar series, 20 years of cartoon, now a full-length series, the Netflix show Messiah. Messianic consciousness is more pervasive in so-called non-religious culture, like Tara, your work points out, than it is all the Christians have given up on it. So I think whatever position we take, I think we have to accept, if we don't have an account of progress that's better than Elon Musk, or better than Mark Andreessen, or better than those people who actually are taking us to the stars, then why should they listen to any of us? And I say that as one of the people who's very skeptical of progress. I say this not as my position, but maybe just as a radical reframing of sort of that we must take into account a global vision. And the final thought on this is there's a great book translated into 13 languages by Vittorio Hussain, the great German philosopher, that he gave at the Moscow Academy of Sciences, called Die Philosophie der ökologischen Krise. The only language I know it's not in is English, so Colleen and I are going to translate it this year. He gave it in the 90s, and he points out two facts that he thinks all rational people have to deal with. The result of the nuclear discoveries mean we have the capacity to destroy the world, so we must be, as humans, responsible for that power. That is an undeniable power. So if we think of progress as the growth of power, no one can debate the power we have achieved. If we're not willing to take responsibility for it, we cede it to the worst elements of society. And then secondly, we will, by our own technological society, destroy the world ecologically. And we have that power. And we have to somehow take responsibility for that too.
That's all upside down. I mean, everything was right in what you said, I think, except when you said that, you know, we sort of have to meet the competition. What the Christian tradition offers, and I won't speak for others, is an alternative to even thinking about ourselves and our condition in relation to that. The answer to all these debates about progress and fighting about modernity is preach the gospel, period. Preach the gospel. And show people that the other direction, you know, there's that, you know, we live in not only on the horizontal plane, but on the vertical plane. And that the escape from it is vertical. It is not forward or back.
I mean,
and I agree with everything you said up until then. I thought it was an advertisement for saying, you know, leave all that behind and follow me. Drop your nets.
I mean, it seems that one of the questions that I'm sort of is interestingly teased out from the question of faith and progress becomes what is the role of the person of faith in affecting the shape of history, which is, I think, is coming out from what we're all discussing here from different perspectives, which is if we have certain kinds of theological anthropologies that orient us towards a sense of the eternal, what does that mean for our actions in history? And does that mean we have either responsibility, what responsibilities might we have or not have to it? I don't agree with you, but you make a compelling case. However, I do think my instinct there and my concerns there are also practical, which is to say, I think any kind of version of getting oneself in positions of global power in order to enact particular, even the version of the world we think is best, requires us to get close to the halls of power, and I cannot imagine a way of getting close to the halls of power that is not like bad for the soul, you know. And then I'm sure we can posit someone who is sort of takes upon themselves the sort of the sins of whatever it takes to get to either political power or economic power. But chances are it's not good for the individual soul. And then how do we think about then it? Is there a sort of Christian effective altruism that we can sort of hypothetically posit?
Effective altruism.
Okay. that says, you know, what matters is sort of particular outcomes for the world, be they material or be they ideological. Or is the kind of either localism or even some kind of spiritual individualism the sort of necessary path of a person with belief in faith and the eternal? I feel like the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Just an instinct that I have, which is to say, it seems to me ridiculous and anti-human to imagine, from a Christian perspective, that there is no sort of ethical obligation I have to make the world better. That there is sort of no way that I must participate in politics, small p politics in some case. And yet it does seem to me, and this is purely sort of instinct, that my job is not to sort of become president and fix the world. And so I guess I'm curious how we see our role in history relative to the concept of an eternity and of a moral eternity.
Joey, I think you were gonna.
I'm glad you mentioned Hobbes. Well, and I'll also say, one of the other curiosities is like, it turns out that we do live in the shadow of a bunch of thinkers, right? Whose visions of the world have shaped our very way of approaching these kinds of questions. Hobbes is one of these guys. Hobbes is like maybe the earliest progress guy, and his vision of progress is that we'll all be gradually, the commodious living that's authorized by a Leviathanic state will gradually make us care less about religious superstitions. So he had a vision of, he's the guy who gave us the world we live in, basically, right? Where we'll all have stuff, we'll stop caring so much about miracles and things like that, and we'll all be fat and happy, and it'll all be great. The one thing I'll offer is that, it seems to me that early modern political philosophy especially, but also the stuff you see in Bacon, is less, or maybe it's an accidental continuation of a lot of the same impulses of Christianity, but they were acting against it explicitly, and they were very, Epicurus is the guiding guy. Hobbes is very deeply Epicurean. Bacon has this Epicurean thing. There's something weird happening with Epicurus and Lucretius in early modern philosophy. That's this whole, we can fight it out afterwards, but the early modern guys are really, like, in a certain sense, angry about at least doctrinal Christianity and the kinds of disputes that it causes. And their way out is they're trying to make us all fat and stop caring about these kinds of ideas, right?
Where's Anna?
Yeah, we're.
Anna. Okay. Well, she wanted to know about, working hard to make the world better. One other difference that Joseph Smith introduced to his Christian brethren is a radically optimistic view of human nature. Very, very different than original sin emphasis. So positive about our capacity to become and to do good. He thought we could become gods. And that theosis is the project of human life. And that this earth is heaven. And we are intended to transform this earth through our virtue.
And I'm not sure if you know about the Mormon transhumanists, but there are a lot of them.
Yeah,
and
they're in my text right now.
And obviously the Protestantism and Catholicism also have an idea of theosis is just radically different. Yeah. What you were describing is the kind of like Stuart Brand thing, like we are as gods, we might as well get good at it, which sounds great, except that, and I do think there's like a mission of humanity to sort of mediate divine power in a good way. But that also is like, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it, is like absolutely Tolkien's ring. It is absolutely satanic in another level, which is what Professor Lillo is kind of getting at. Like that is what, I now have a sort of vision of like Tolkien as a kind of Bardian, which is probably wrong. But anyway, where's Anna? I feel like we should wrap up, so I'm going to take like 2 more questions. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to make a comment and see what any of you think about it, but I'm a historian, and people will sometimes ask, like, is progress the rule of history? And I always say I can't answer that because it's circular. Like, you can always look back at the past and see that things have changed, and you can always look back and compare past times to your own and say things are so much better. But what are the criteria of judgment you're using to say this is better than what I see in the past? Those criteria and those values you're using are a product of the present, and they're a product of those same historical processes that you're looking at. So of course, it's easy to just automatically say, well, of course things are better now than they were then, because you are a product of the present and you are judging according to the values of the present. And I think, at least going back the last 300 years, I know it gets, I'll try not to paint with too broad a brush, but any period you can always find people saying, this is the most enlightened time, this is the greatest time to live of any time in history. And then you can always find people rejecting that and saying, no, this is the worst, the most decadent, the most depraved. And often they're just reflecting back in negative form the same values, they're just inverting them, right? And creating an opposite trajectory of history. And it seems very easy to get caught in just one or the other of those poles and not step back and say, what are the criteria I'm using and how did I end up thinking and judging and valuing in this way? And to me, that seems like the big question that I wonder from everyone from this panel is like, how do you step out and how do you feel confident that you are, that in the criteria and the values that you're using to judge our time versus some future or past time, how do you feel that you are just reflecting, you are just a product of our moment, our place and time?
You go ahead.
Yeah,
It's your birthday.
very briefly. It's a great question, Sam. So I grew up because the Restoration, the Mormon Restoration, requires that there was a great apostasy. I was really taught that the Catholic Church was the great and abominable church. My dad was a missionary in Argentina, and he would tell me about that, the idol-worshiping Catholics. And I just really grew up, like, that's what I was taught. Catholics were just really wrong about everything. And then I went on a study abroad to France, and I walked into Chartres Cathedral. And I thought, this is the most amazing, beautiful place I've ever been. And everything I've been taught is wrong. And in fact, the modern world is not better than this. And that cathedral has guided my whole life, really. And George, you asked what indices would tell us if we're making progress. Cathedrals per capita, newly built and refurbished with stained glass would be my index of choice.
I think we have probably time for one more question. Should we? Yeah. Go for it.
Over the past 150 years, the secular world has come up with a pretty compelling cosmogony, Big Bang, evolution, yada yada, and the religions of the world have had to deal with that in some way. Now seems there might be a pretty compelling secular eschatology, like climate change or rogue AI, or we all get uploaded and become immortal computers. How are we going to integrate that? Will we integrate that? What does it look like?
Wasn't that cosmogony actually like a Jewish Christian thing? Actually, the initial impulse of it, because the previous thing was that the universe is eternal and permanent, and the real change is that it was created, right? So, I mean, they've secularized it, but it seems like that the idea, at least, has come out of a religious tradition.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mean like a change in the shape. I just mean a change in the content of the narrative.
Sure, that's fair.
Tara, you've written about this stuff.
Yeah. I guess I'm not convinced that what calls sort of secular eschatology is at all incompatible with at least sort of, I can speak only from a Christian perspective here, a sort of a Christian sense of how the world might end. Which is to say, I think that there is, and again, I think like eschatology is, it's impossible to speak of a Christian eschatology because I think it's among the most sort of diffuse and diverse theological places, denomination to denomination.
Going to be so many amazing heavens out there.
I mean, how the world ends. But I think the idea that human action, and particularly prideful human action, that our attempt to control nature or to have certain kinds of mastery over ourselves, one another, and the earth might backfire quite badly, feels, I think, insofar as it accords with, it certainly accords with Christian theological anthropology. To the extent that I think that I don't think that Christianity or Christians need to kind of radically reshape our view of the end times because the likely existential risks to the human condition have or appear in the cultural consciousness in these extremely specific ways, which is to say, I mean, I hope they don't happen.
Yeah.
I probably think it's like reasonably likely that they will happen. But I think that the way to understand that is through, again, the moral, like a moral lens, a theological lens, a lens of the eternal. This is what we as human beings have kind of always done and will keep doing until we make it impossible for ourselves so to do. I don't think we can we create the existential AI and we trigger Christ coming back. I don't think it works like that. I certainly don't suggest we try it. But I think it's precisely like I think that theological anthropology is more important than specific eschatological outcomes in reading and assessing and engaging with the kinds of existential risks that appear to be on the horizon at this present moment.
Yeah. I feel like this is literally just only now getting good, which is really frustrating. I mean, this is...
Ouch! Susannah.
No, I didn't mean that. I love you all so much. Happy birthday, Zach. That's not what I meant. I meant this has been getting good and it's getting better, and it's like eschatologically going to keep getting better until we all like do theosis, but in like not in a Mormon way because I'm a Protestant. Anyway,
some of us in a Mormon way.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to end with this.